And again, you're upregulating tyrosine hydroxylase. That's just with 9-MeBC. Now with bromantane in the picture, it's an actoprotector chemical.
The flames and you put me through hell. I had to learn how to fight for myself, and we both know all the truth I could tell. I'll just say this is I wish you farewell. I hope you're somewhere praying. I hope you're
all right, what's up, everybody? It's your boy Ryan, and this is the Thunder Channel on nootropics, on testosterone, on biohacking, and on male performance. Please subscribe to the channel. If any of that interests you, hit the bell to get notified of all future content, because I'm pumping out all kinds of content these days. All kinds.
Then you gonna make all kinds of gains. All kinds.
Please like the video if you like anything that I say or anything resonates with you. I'd love for you to just hit that like button, bro. Behind this broadcast is my nootropics company, which makes a couple of really cool products. Number one, the Torque Nootropics Stack. And I'll explain all this stuff later. We've got some consulting options on livecortex.com for TRT, blood work, nootropics, and a host of other things. You can check all that stuff out in the description of this video. Okay, let's talk about anhedonia and many routes that I think you should take if you're trying to fix it. I first want to say that anhedonia is a terrible place to be. I've induced it several times with like experiments gone wrong and managed to recover myself and recover my general emotional state. So I'm going to give you guys what I think are what I found to be the best routes to go, because it seems to be different for different people. And a lot of people think it's just strictly dopamine and you need to enhance dopamine, but the dopaminergic system is entirely too complex for that simple of an approach, right? If you just give yourself precursor, well, how do you know it's signaling well? You know, if you have good signaling, a good precursor, well, what's the state of the receptor sites? You kind of have to have a multifold approach. And at the same time, there are other things besides just exogenously administering precursors to neurotransmitters like dopamine that affect the dopaminergic system, like testosterone, right? And hormones. All right, so anyway, and I'll get to that stuff in a second, but let me quickly explain anhedonia. It's just a state of absolute apathy for everything, right? No feeling, no hardcore emotion. You really don't get pleasure from things that used to give you pleasure. It's hard to laugh. It's hard to cry. You're kind of just in this even keel of emotion where you're not high, you're not low, you're in the middle. You're apathetic. You really don't feel all that much. And it's a shitty place to be, and there are a lot of things that induce it. So to save some time and not talk about all the things that induce anhedonia, which is like SSRIs, having tanked testosterone and crappy hormone profile, among other things, mostly pharmaceutical agents or otherwise chemicals that may have fussed with brain chemistry or hormones, I'm just going to get right into avenues of approach. So let's start. Now, depending on what induced your anhedonia, this may be a dopaminergic problem. But interestingly, if you look further into the literature, you find that it's not exclusively dopamine, but a lack of activation of certain brain regions, which may be influenced by dopamine. In fact, I think this paper, which is titled Neurobiological Mechanisms of Anhedonia, kind of lays that out pretty clearly in the end of this initial abstract, which goes, the analysis of anhedonic non-clinical subjects, non-anhedonic depressed patients, and depressed patients with various levels of anhedonia seem to favor the hypothesis that the severity of anhedonia is associated with a deficit of activity of the ventral striatum, including the nucleus accumbens, and an excess of activity of ventral region of the prefrontal cortex, including the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and the orbital frontal cortex, with a pivotal, but not exclusive role of dopamine. So right to what you can do to alleviate the dopaminergic issue if dopamine is the problem. Number one, 9-methylbeta-carbolene. 9-methylbeta-carbolene. This is a research chemical that was studied for Parkinson's disease and is quite effective in that context, and attempts to, and there's rat literature and then there's human literature on this, regulate dopamine neuron firing by regulating dopamine gene expression for dopamine neuron generation. At the same time, it upregulates dopamine conversion enzymes like tyrosine hydroxylase. You need high quantities of tyrosine hydroxylase in order to take precursor, which would be L-tyrosine, and convert it to dopa, and then dopa to dopamine, and then subsequently neuroadrenaline and adrenaline. So 9-methylbeta-carbolene in, call it a 40 milligram dose for 40 days straight, and then cycling off for 2 weeks just for good measure, because it's a research chemical. We don't have a ton of research behind it. And then cycling back on, depending on whether or not you've gotten some alleviation of your anhedonia, would be like step number one. Now, this is assuming that dopamine is your problem. Stepping back a little bit from steps, if you want a diagnosis strategy, right, a way to diagnose if dopamine is the issue, then perhaps you should get your hands on a chemical called cabergoline. Now, cabergoline is a prescription compound, so I just want to make that absolutely clear for YouTube and everyone else. And by the way, this is just an educational video. However, Cabergoline exhibits a very, very high affinity for dopamine D2 receptors as well as some other dopamine receptors. But importantly, it has an extremely long half-life of between 60 and 80 hours where the cabergoline occupies the D2 dopamine receptors for a long period of time with an extremely high affinity. It is actually a full agonist. It's not a partial agonist. It doesn't semi-bind, with like medium affinity to the dopamine receptors. It is a full agonist at the dopamine D2 receptor. So essentially, it's kind of like dopamine replacement. Now, do I suggest being on cabergoline long-term? No, because people with Parkinson's disease are on high doses of cabergoline long-term, and therein lies like ventricular cardiac problems. I don't know if you've heard of that, but you should probably research it. So long-term use of very high doses does not seem to be very safe in a very small percentage of people that end up with left ventricular hypertrophy and other cardiac problems. I want to make it clear, though, in doses like perhaps 0.25 milligrams twice a week, which are kind of comparable to the doses suggested for hyperprolactinemia, like excessive levels of prolactin from, ingesting kratom or smoking cannabis, or, God forbid, having a pituitary tumor that is secreting excessive levels of prolactin. At those doses, there is zero evidence. I report zero evidence that cabergoline induces left ventricular hypertrophy or otherwise cardiac problems. There's a lot of people that mix that up, that go, just cabergoline is bad because we've heard this. There is zero evidence, and frankly, lots of evidence to the contrary in terms of actual studies and anecdotals that, low dose cabergoline is not going to give you cardiac problems. I just want to make that clear. Again, cabergoline is a D2 receptor agonist, and what you would be doing by using cabergoline in the case of anhedonia is just using it as a diagnosis tool. All you're trying to do is figure out if dopamine is your problem, because if you take cabergoline and you have alleviation of your anhedonic symptoms, well, then you know that you've got to target dopamine, and preferably with something less hardcore pharmaceutical, perhaps more research chemical based, or even as natural as you can get if you're one of those people that wants to take that route of using like mucuna, purines, or L-tyrosine, a combination of those and 9-MEBC, maybe some bromontane, which I'm going to get to in just a second here. But cabergoline is a good diagnostic tool. If you take cabergoline, you get alleviation, then you know your problem is probably dopamine centered. At which point, okay, number 2, so I guess, 2.5 or something, strategy for here, after using cabergoline potentially to figure out if it's dopamine. If it is dopamine and you figure that out, you could use strategy number 1 of 9-MEBC, 40-day cycle of 40 milligrams or so. And the second predominant strategy would be to use a combination of 9-methylbeta-carboline or 9-MEBC and a chemical called bromontane with the addition of low-dose daily L-tyrosine. And now you're doing a bunch of things on the dopaminergic system, right? You're actually having a much more complex but specific way to recover the system. You're working on dopamine neuron regeneration. You're enhancing the gene expression, right? The underlying functionality, which is the basis of dopaminergic neurons and their proliferation and function. And again, you're upregulating tyrosine hydroxylase. That's just with 9-MEBC. Now with bromontane in the picture, it's an actoprotector chemical, which also will enhance the function of both the dopamine conversion enzymes, tyrosine hydroxylase and dopa decarboxylase. That's turning your tyrosine into dopa and then your dopa into actual dopamine. At the same time, you got those two chemicals in the mix, right? You may want to consider bringing the precursor into the mix as well, because where are you getting your dopamine from? Ultimately, in order to synthesize dopamine into the end product of dopamine, you're synthesizing, again, tyrosine into dopa and then dopa into dopamine. Well, you need a raw supply of tyrosine. Now, you can get that from tyrosine-rich foods like beef and bananas and other, I think nuts have tyrosine in them, certain nuts. Or you could administer a tyrosine supplement, an L-tyrosine supplement. I can't give you a dose range because it's going to be different for different people, because that stuff will also convert to noradrenaline and adrenaline. And that's going to give you potentially anxiety, or at the very least give you alertness. It may be great. You should just be like super alert and feeling good. So tread carefully on that. But that would be the second primary strategy: 9-MEBC, bromontane, and L-tyrosine. Number 3 strategy that you can employ to resolve dopamine, but at the same time potentially sensitize serotonin receptor function as well as serotonin synthesis, which for some people is going to be a part of recovering their anhedonia, is getting on testosterone replacement therapy. Now, I guess there's something to say for trying to naturally optimize your testosterone, but as I've said before, like as I was approaching 39, I was using a very complex protocol to do that naturally, and it was like 20 something chemicals. And then suddenly out of nowhere, for no discernible reason, my test went from like 900 or something to 770. So it just, as I aged, it got to the point where it was a lot more difficult for me to do it naturally. Now, of course, before going on TRT, you could try things like kisspeptin, gonadorelin, or HCG. These are all effectively gonadotropin replacement, which is going to make you make more testosterone intratesticularly from either signaling LH and FSH receptors or by replacing GnRH, this sort of parent hormone for LH and FSH, which then signals to the testicles to make testosterone. Or you could just skip all the bullshit and just go right on TRT and stop with all your apprehensions and will I be on it forever? Look, you have anhedonia, right? Okay, you want to get to the bottom of it. The same can be said for people with sexual dysfunction. They're like, have all these things they read on the web and all these reluctancies and apprehensions. It's like, okay, fine, stay in the place you're in. Okay, cool. Or take the dive, get on TRT, and try to fix your problem. I'll take you to a paper called Testosterone's Regulation of Sex Steroid-Related mRNAs and Dopamine-Related mRNAs in Adolescent Male Rat Substantia nigra. There's a couple really relevant parts here relative to how testosterone, just in and of itself, we're not even talking about estrogen, which we will in a second, testosterone helps regulate, helps synthesize more dopamine and therefore the dopaminergic pathways. There's a quick paragraph I want to read from this paper, and it goes, testosterone-dependent actions in neurons are direct via activation of androgen receptors or indirect by conversion of 17B estradiol, which is estradiol, and activation of estrogen receptors. How midbrain dopamine neurons respond to sex steroids depends on the presence of sex steroid receptors and the level of steroid conversion enzymes, aromatase and 5-alpha reductase. They basically investigated they basically castrated rats in this particular case and then gave them testosterone to see if it could improve dopamine levels by modifying tyrosine hydroxylase, again, a dopamine conversion enzyme. What they found is they actually identified estrogen receptors, ERA, and androgen receptors in midbrain dopamine neurons in adolescent male rats, indicating that dopamine neurons are poised to respond to circulating sex steroids. And this has been known in literature for quite some time. I've known it for many years in my consulting practice on this. And one of the mechanisms of action is that testosterone and DHT, which is a metabolite of testosterone via, it 5-alpha reducing to DHT, increase tyrosine hydroxylase protein. They go on to say further, and this is the actual conclusion, testosterone may increase local dopamine synthesis and metabolism, thereby changing dopamine regulation within the substantia nigra. Okay, so testosterone itself, just via the conversion to DHT, may help alleviate your anhedonia via helping you to synthesize and make more dopamine. Now, at the same time, okay, testosterone is going to convert to one of its metabolites, which is 17-beta estradiol, or estrogen, like the primary estrogen. And estrogen promotes synthesis, prevents degradation, and inhibits the reuptake of serotonin mildly. It's not a CERT inhibitor or something like an SSRI, but it will allow the serotonin receptors to resensitize to some extent and keep serotonin around synaptically available to bind to receptor sites. Now, like stepping back a sec from the literature and the science part of this, like guys on TRT that, their testosterone converts to estrogen, some of them that are taking aromatase inhibitors, which I do suggest for most guys that are on testosterone, because unless you're using testosterone propionate or a very short ester, you're going to be kind of continuously via the long half-lives of some of these esters converting your testosterone to estrogen. So they've got to manage it. But some of those guys, when they oversuppress estrogen, completely lose their ability to feel pleasure for things. Like they can't cry, they can't be happy about things, they're just in a generally depressed, apathetic, anhedonic-like state. So what does that tell us? It tells us that extremely low estradiol can also be a cause of anhedonia. And if you don't want to go that far, I don't know if I'm reaching there or speculating. I'm just drawing the conclusions from the literature and my consulting experience and the anecdotal data that's out there on the web. But if you wanted to take that route of it, in addition to testosterone helping dopamine, estradiol will help your general neurochemistry or neurocircuitry regarding feeling good and having positive emotions and the reward center functioning normally. Because again, estrogen is going to enhance a general function of the serotonergic system via enhancing the receptor sites, as well as promoting synthesis and keeping serotonin around at some capacity. You'll hear anecdotally on the TRT subreddit and the testosterone subreddit. There's two different subreddits that are largely discussion about testosterone replacement therapy, where guys, if their estrogen gets too high, they start fucking crying watching movies and they get overly emotional, right? When estrogen gets past a certain point, it is very, very easy to almost behave like a woman in terms of emotions. You know, you have high estrogen levels, right? If you're on TRT, that tends to bring all that up, but you actually feel again. So this may be beneficial in conjunction with testosterone for helping dopamine, for the estradiol to exert its effect at the receptor side, which is probably also allowing you to have better emotions from baseline, as well as modulating serotonin pathways, which will give you some of your emotion back as well. So the primary and, the third strategy here would be to get on TRT, both for the dopamine synthesis and the dopamine enhancement that's going to take place from testosterone and its conversion to DHT, as well as the serotonin receptor sensitizing effects and serotonin metabolism effects, positive effects of estradiol, as well as potentially just exclusively estradiol's effect binding to the receptors in terms of making you emotional. I noticed this myself. Like if I don't manage estradiol, which I don't not manage estradiol, but there've been periods where I've experimented to see like how high could it go and how do I feel? Abso-fucking-lutely, dude, I have more emotion. And when it gets past a certain point for me and it's like 35, 40 picograms per milliliter, then yeah, like I think I've always cried at like certain movies, certain sad movies or whatever, but I'll certainly get like more sentimental or nostalgic. And yeah, like if there's a movie on that has some like what was the last one that really fucking got me? I think it was Top Gun, dude. The new Top Gun Maverick. Got me, bro. So that's just something to consider. TRT will increase testosterone. That's going to increase dopamine. It's also going to increase estrogen, and that's going to make you more emotional. So you may find that, just having testosterone in the mix, that you alleviate or cure your anhedonia, because now you got more dopamine firing consistently. You're going to be synthesizing it more via tyrosine hydroxylase upregulation and expression, which we explained before, dopamine conversion, as well as this estradiol influence on serotonin pathways. And those would be the primary methods that I would use to try to alleviate your anhedonia. Again, using cabergoline or an otherwise D2 agonist. I'd probably stick with cabergoline if you can get your hands on it, as a diagnostic tool, not as like a resolution, although some people may actually get resolution of their anhedonia with cabergoline, but then it's like, I don't think it's prescribed for that. So how are you going to continue taking it? Have to go UGL or something to this effect. But if you're able to identify that dopamine is the predominant issue via taking cabergoline and getting resolution or alleviation from your symptoms, well, then you could work on like the 9-methyl-beta-carboline strategy or the 9-MEBC bromontane tyrosine strategy. Or again, you could use testosterone replacement. You can really use all this stuff, testosterone replacement therapy, which again is going to give you more estrogen and sensitize serotonin receptors and also modify dopamine function and attempt to, via synthesizing more dopamine and making the signaling better, resolve the dopaminergic problems. Now, would I say that you should use all these together? No, I don't think so. I think you should, maybe use cabergoline as a diagnostic tool initially, or you could even use mucuna purines in high doses initially just to see if you don't want to use a hardcore pharmaceutical drug. I totally get that. If dopamine is the issue, and then I would approach these things one strategy at a time. I'd try 9-MEBC by itself. Give it 40 days. If that doesn't resolve the issue completely, but you still think it's dopamine, try the second strategy of 9-MEBC, bromontane, L-tyrosine. If that helps, because it almost definitely will, but it's not fully resolved, yeah, go on TRT and stop having all these reluctancies about it because you read on the web that you'll be infertile forever. It's not true. You can go on Clomid and post-cycle therapy and get the gonadotropins functioning again and get the Sertoli cells in the testicles to make sperm again. But I don't know if you'd even want to do that, right? Once you go on TRT and you have better strength in the gym and you feel, more energized from baseline and a host of other positive benefits, you're probably not going to want to get off of it. Okay, so that's what I would say about anhedonia and the three predominant strategies to approach resolving it. I have not seen anhedonia be an otherwise neurochemistry issue. I have not seen anhedonia be, or no one has really validated, nor have I seen any validating scientific literature that it is a gastrointestinal problem, like a gut bacteria problem that is preventing the synthesis of certain neurotransmitters. Although you should always work on that, right? I mean, maybe taking the right probiotics, like some of the bifido strains, which will help you synthesize more serotonin, would be useful in these cases. and making sure that you don't have like an inflammatory process taking place in your body, because inflammatory cytokines inhibit the production of neurotransmitters at the gastrointestinal level. So you don't want that, right? So make sure your gut's in good health either way. But I've not seen some of these other far-reaching, frankly, non-scientific, because there's no correlation there. There's just no connection there. Theories be involved in, what you may call the pathogenesis of anhedonia. I've just not seen it. I've seen it be dopamine centric and hormone centric. As I said at the beginning, if you need to hire me for anything related to physiology that I have expertise in, and you can check out all the points of expertise at livecortex.com on the consulting tab on the menu, whether it's your TRT protocol, nootropic stack formulation, or it's anhedonia. It's something I have a lot of experience with. And host of other things, you can hire me in under a minute at livecortex.com and go book an email consult or a call consult, whatever suits your budget and what you want to do. I mentioned TRT, various points in this video. I wrote a guide on it. If you're thinking about getting on TRT, I can tell you everything you need to know from the scientific perspective, as well as the 6+ years working with men's protocols, as well as being on TRT myself. You can get the Getting on TRT guide at livecortex.com. And our nootropic stack for you nootropics enthusiasts. Look, if you want powerful brain energy that lasts a good bit of the day, just buy Torque. The stuff is exceptionally powerful. Look, take 2 capsules, have brain stimulation, have energy, turn your brain on to be able to be productive, happy, and like in a great mood. It is an absolute no-brainer, no pun intended. Buy Torque at livecortex.com, or you can also buy the Torque stack on Amazon. All right, everybody, it's been a pleasure being with you. I'm now back home at the studio in Pittsburgh. I took a trip to the Lehigh Valley for a graduation party for a family member and to see some of my old stomping grounds. Maybe that's a topic for like another video. It's like, wow, because I actually ended up driving 8 hours. I came from Ohio from a business meeting, drove all the way to the Lehigh Valley, and then back to Pittsburgh, which is about 4.5 hours. So I drove a total of 12 hours, and like how that affect like jet lag from driving, and how I was able to like function really well at this family get together, and like a topic for another video. Anyway, back to content. Much more coming this week. Live stream this Saturday, 10 a.m. Eastern time. Make sure you're signed up to get notifications of everything that drops from this channel, because I'm prolific, motherfucker. All right, everyone. Later.
I'll just say this as I wish you farewell. I hope you're somewhere praying. I hope your soul is changing.